I'll let everybody filter in. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I know we've got a few more people left to come in. So just while we're waiting before we start the session this evening, my name's Becky and I work for Gain. Thank you so much to our panelists for this wonderful panel we're about to have, and thank you guys for joining us. If you don't know too much about the work of Gain, we're a small charitable organisation and we work to get more women into the investment management industry. We want to change the 20% application rate at entry level up to 50%. And we do that through talks like this, school events, university events, and lots more. So you can find more about us at gainuk.org if you want to check us out or sign up for our newsletter or see what other events we've got on. That would be great. But I'm going to hand you over now to Katya, who is one of our panelists and is going to be moderating tonight's event. So Katya, over to you.
Becky, thank you so much for that introduction, and really delighted to be an active volunteer for Gain, which I think is an amazing organization with a very important mission. My name is Katya Lenov. I'm a principal at Aviditi Advisors, which is a firm with offices around the globe. And in a very simple way, we help primarily private equity funds raise capital from institutional investors. So firms like insurance company, corporate pensions, family offices, endowments and foundations, etc. So that's a little bit about me, but I'd like to, before we kick off on our very interesting topic today of technology and the future of investment management, I'd like to invite our panelists to introduce ourselves, and perhaps, Joe, you could kick things off.
Grand. So I'm Joe Reynolds. So I'm COO and Chief Operating Officer, Chief Compliance Officer at Cederberg Capital. We are a London-based asset manager with a China focus. We've got an office in London, an office in Shanghai. So at the moment, my focus is very much on technology as it sort of impacts every part of what we do, whether we like it or not.
Thanks, Joe. Sandra?
Hey everyone, I'm Sandra Griess. I work for Independent Franchise Partners, a London-based global public equity fund. I'm a data scientist and data engineer. So I my role mostly involves managing data, internal and external data sets, and build tools using that data to help the investment team with their investment decisions. I think, yeah, and that's it. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Sisieta, Owen. I work for Fnality International, which happens to be a fintech firm. I'm actually helping create the risk management framework at the moment, and I'm a director with risk oversight responsibilities.
Thanks, Sisieta. Really interesting and diverse backgrounds, I think. So should be a great discussion. And I just want to mention before we start that the Q&A box, the chat box is very much open. And so if there are any questions, any burning questions that you have and that you'd like to ask the panelists, please just pop them into the chat box and we will try to address as many as possible over the course of the next hour. So let's dive right in. Technology, it's a topic that obviously is important in all of our lives, in and out of the office. I think it's changed a lot over the last 10 years or so. When I first started in finance, people were still running around with BlackBerries, and many of you may not even know what BlackBerries are. I don't think I had a LinkedIn profile. It certainly was not a way to do business. And I don't even want to mention Zoom, because even when the pandemic kicked off, I had no idea myself what Zoom was. And I never imagined that we'd be hosting an event like this virtually. So a lot has changed. And I'd love to hear from our panelists your perspective on the changes over the last 10 years or so, how they've impacted your day-to-day life in investment management, and perhaps what are some of the trends and some of the maybe predictions you have of what things will look like over the next 10 years. So maybe Sisieta, we can start with you.
Okay, trends. I personally, I think technology has indeed come a long way. Again, to your point, in the days of using Blackberries from now, where we've got very, I'll say, savvy ways of communication, and you know, the whole virtual meeting space as well. And you look at the impact that COVID has had, it's really pushed us to lean more on technology, and that's driven the expansion of the sort of in the innovation space. In terms of, you know, what I perceive going to happen in terms of trends, I think we're never going to go back to what the normal used to be. I think we're now getting more comfortable and not as afraid of the term technology, because we've sort of been pushed and almost forced to go into that space. So firms have embraced it in a different way. Individuals have embraced it in a different way. So it's more a case now of, well, you know, how more efficient can this make us is where we are now. Like, how can we drive the efficiency up? How can we drive the outputs up? And, you know, what's the next sort of new way of doing things we're sort of looking for in the technology space. So I just think that the impact of technology is just really on an upward sort of moving trend at the moment.
It's interesting because I don't think, you know, 10 years ago, the term Fintech even existed. I mean, maybe even 5 years ago. And now it seems to be one of the hottest spaces to go into at the start of your career and throughout your career. So definitely from a career perspective, it seems technology has created a lot of interesting new opportunities.
Yeah. No, sorry, go on. No, I was just going to say, and that's one very key example. The rise of fintechs is really an illustration of, you know, how we're beginning to think of technology in what we can do with it, and how, you know, how we go about our day-to-day sort of activities in the workplace with technology. So when you start seeing a lot of startups and fintechs coming through, it's to really open up that space. Hence, I do really think that it's just going to move on from here.
And to that end, you know, you hear a lot about things like blockchain and machine learning and big data and lots of big, complicated buzzwords. You hear about politicians taking paychecks in Bitcoin, and, you know, hedge funds starting cryptocurrency investment businesses. Are these things that are kind of in the news, fake news in the media that we hear about? Or are these actually happening, impacting day-to-day roles, and something that you think in the future is going to be completely normal and you know, considered a normal sector and part of normal day life?
I mean, I think from my side, when I started, I mean, 10 years ago, I started further back than I'd care to remember. But I think at that point, technology was about an arms race. It was about spend. And it was, if you think about all the investment was on generating revenue. You know, where would you find the edge? So whether it was huge data centers, the investment, everything was local. You know, you had your own communications room, you had your own technology teams, you invested millions of dollars in hardware and software and building teams. And then since then you've got cloud. The cloud has come along and sort of democratization of technology, right? It sort of starts to filter back. You no longer have to be a Goldman's or a huge US investment bank sort of throwing tens or hundreds of millions of dollars at these things. Suddenly, you know, anyone can fire up a cloud instance with Amazon and access incredibly powerful, you know, software and huge amounts of data. And I think as time's gone on, the technologies touched more and more and sort of gone through every aspect of sort of the finance industry. So something like blockchain, you know, I think from my side, on the operations piece, it will be that centralization, you know, the ability to make efficiencies, you know, whether it be in sort of the reconciliations, whether it be in, you know, when you're trading, you know, a single golden record that everyone agrees in, rather than all these sort of separate entities. I think the use case for blockchain is, well, certainly from as I understand it, is everyone agrees there's some real utility there. But I think it seems to me we're still in a situation where people are trying to claim or monetize that to their own end. I think the advantage of blockchain in theory is about centralization and making sure that no one entity or no one firm kind of owns or controls or is able to monetize that to that degree. And I think until you get sort of a normalization, until there's a sort of a standardization across the board, I think it all seems a little bit abstract as opposed to sort of real world uses. There are firms that are trying desperately to do that, whether it be in asset management or real estate or whatever. But it's from my side, admittedly, I'm far removed from the pointy end of blockchain, but it's theoretically great, but I really don't see real world sort of wide adoption yet. I think it will come. I think it's inevitable, but.
Can I just add a little bit on that one as well, please? Like, just I've been in finance for 3 years, and from my just point of view, in terms of like not having experienced the massive sort of change and shift in the way technology is being used in the industry, I think there are 2 points that we always need to bear in mind on that front. And it's like it is a massive industry, and I'm just going to speak from the asset management side of things, not even from the investment banking or other sides of the industry. But there are 2 things we always need to bear in mind, is that blockchain is a great technology that is definitely picking up a lot of hype, but we need to remember that not everyone understands it and not everyone has that skill set or to deploy something as big as a blockchain technology. I think there's a lot of education that needs to come through in the industry. So in terms of the next 10 years, I think we're talking about the end of the 10 years if we're going to start seeing a massive disruption from that sort of technology. But if I'm just looking at the 3 years that I've been involved in the industry, and there's already a huge uptake in accepting technology in terms of big data and the other buzzwords, so the other AI, machine learning, automation, processing, all of these technologies are definitely being embraced more and more. And I think 5 years ago they weren't really accepted in the industry, and we're already seeing them becoming more of the norm. Blockchain, I think, is a bigger step to take on that front, just for the time it will take to get everyone on board with what it even does or means, or the advantage added on that front. I think that's sort of what I'm seeing for the next 10 years with blockchain. The rest is definitely in 3 years, a lot has changed, and I can imagine it just speeding up more and more on that front.
That's a relief, because it means I have 10 years to get up to speed with blockchain technology.
Oh, we all do. We all do.
Well, I will probably add to that a little bit, because even with the blockchain, I do think that we would see that coming to life a lot quicker than 10 years. So I'm actually in the middle or in the front of the sort of advancing of the blockchain activity at the moment. So Fnality International, actually in the process of creating a DLT model for trade settlement. So a payment system which actually deals in the settlement of trades, and basically using the DLT type technology, which is really decentralizing. So the whole aim is decentralizing, creating more efficiencies and removing the risk from the financial system, because you then remove this sort of counterparty risk that you get involved in the settlement of trades. That is well the wheels have kicked off, and we're actually really at the point of getting that up and running, and that's going to go over 5 sort of jurisdictions in different the main global currencies. So if that was to happen, then, well, not was to happen, that it is happening, we will start to see a lot of uptake, a movement in the blockchain space, probably not in the traditional blockchain, how it was initiated, but then we've been looking at, from the settlements and trade settlements, payments side of things, you'll be seeing the efficiencies coming through. And just like everything else, right? So, you have the key central banks who are the major players, and then you have the significant investment banks who buy into it. And as soon as you have the key market players in there, you start to see all the other sort of financial institutions wanting to get on board as well. And that's how the trend picks up, and that's how it starts. So watch the space, because I really don't think blockchain has got far long to go before, we begin to see it ripple through the economy.
I think you'll see it from the regulators, because fundamentally, if you can, as you say, if you can de-risk settlement, then it essentially that trickles down to the investors, right? The sort of, if I want to put my pension and give it to an investment manager to look after, the financial regulator, the FCA, the SEC, or whatever, want to make sure we're protected. So
exactly,
you'll get the regulators will start. I don't think anyone's arguing with the logic and the business case behind it. So I think there's a degree to which, as you say, it gets critical mass, or a regulator starts standing behind it and insisting this is the case, then it sort of becomes
it has a ripple effect, and everyone wants to start to know how can we get on board to, like you said, risk is the key word, de-risking.
I think
get the risk out.
The challenge will be sort of organizing how the infrastructure sits around that in a way that sort of doesn't add additional risks in terms of everyone sort of being pointy elbowed about getting market share and generating revenues off the back of it, but that's another discussion.
Exactly, but that itself would have to be looked at in detail, as in having bolt-ons and build-ons on top of that. But I think the initial starting point is really for the main purposes of, let's get the efficiency in, let's take the risk out, and let's help with the strategic objectives of the regulators in terms of market stability.
Interesting. If we take a step back, a lot of these are quite complex topics. My question is, what would you advise students today as they choose the area in which they want to study? I'd love to hear from Sandra, who is literally a rocket scientist, that's not a joke, with a PhD in physics, about the merits of studying a more technical field, pursuing that from an academic perspective, and then switching into the financial services industry. And on the other hand, I'd like to hear from Joe, who studied philosophy, and how that has impacted your ability to keep up with some of these really, really technical terms, and how students should think about choosing their academic discipline. So maybe we start with Sandra.
Sure, happily. So as Katya said, I come from a very technical background. I did study physics in my undergrad and astrophysics in my postgrad. And what really helped in my case is that I just happened to use a lot of Python, so the coding language, in my time in academia, which meant that skill was just straight away transferable to industry, whether it was this, the tech e-commerce startups that I started my career in, or then finance. I just happened to have a skill that was so easily transferable. And if I could go back in time and do it all over again, I would still do it the same way. Still take this extra long route into the industry, but I think it just meant that in my case, I could really apply, the analytical part and the maths and the numbers and that whole side of things was obviously helpful and super helpful. But for what I do and how my day-to-day role is, obviously I need to know how to code. I automate a lot of processes. I build signals. I analyze data. So all of these different parts of my role need coding and need those skills that I developed when I learned them at university. It's not to say that that is the only way to get into it, but I think for the particular role that I do, and if things like, getting your hands dirty and building things is something that, you find exciting, I do. I think it's something that you should definitely consider. And when you consider, what to study, what to focus on, I'd probably say, look at what is commonly used in industry. So Python happens to be a coding language that is super useful and used in a lot of, different places. It seems to be still the requirement that I see quite a lot for a lot of roles. Not to say that other languages are not as helpful, but I would say probably focus on the languages that are definitely more in demand now than the ones that were in demand, say, 10 years ago. Like I know academia sometimes, at least when I started my academic time, there were languages that were taught to us at university, like, I don't know, Fortran and Perl and things that I don't think you would have even heard of, that nowadays don't add any value to my day-to-day job. But I think, I'd probably, that's my piece of advice, is just choose the language and technologies according to what's really being used right now or spoken about right now.
And Sandra, are there any other languages? You mentioned Python is absolutely critical. What are some of the other ones? We've had one of our participants ask specifically about coding skills. So maybe you can elaborate on what languages are relevant.
Okay, I mean, so it depends on what so I find Python a very all-rounded kind of language, because it's very good for all of the automation side of things. So you can productionize your code very easily and automate a lot of things. I've built scripts that just run every morning before we start our day to, pull data from lots of different data sources and build reports for us for 8 a.m. So we wake up in the morning and we receive the emails with all of that. And I think you can do that very easily in Python. I don't think it's as straightforward to do in other languages, say like R. But R, for example, is a lot more powerful than Python when it comes to a lot of the statistical packages. So it really depends on like which sort of like path you're trying to go down. Same thing for MATLAB. I don't think you can productionize MATLAB as easily as Python. Also, you don't really learn. I personally found that Python was one of the easiest ones to learn. But I know that Go is a language that's really, at least perhaps not in finance, but definitely in the tech and startup scene of London, maybe in fintech, I'm not sure, but at least on the e-commerce side of things, Go is a language that's really picking up. So, if you're curious, I wouldn't be surprised if it infiltrates into finance fairly soon, and is used pretty heavily as well. But I guess it depends on the role that you're really kind of going after. And then the other advantage with Python is that it's got a lot of the machine learning and AI libraries as well that are very, very developed on that front. So if you're going to go down the whole building big machine learning and artificial intelligence models, then it's also very advanced on that front. So I always vouch for Python, but I'm biased because I use it a lot.
Joe, how often do you use Python?
Daily. Yeah. So I mean, I sort of way back when I was sort of at university, it shows how old I am. We were literally, I don't think my first year we had computers in your room. So it was, you had a computer room, you used to go and have to book your slot. So I did sort of 3 years as an arts degree and came out and decided that actually, slightly randomly, that the sort of the logical side, the analytical side of philosophy was of interest, and actually joined a graduate scheme with an IT consultancy. Did that for sort of 18 months and then found myself as a junior developer for a prop trading house, and then spent the next sort of 10 to 12 years coding, 10 to 12 hours a day. and I started on the database side, sort of with Oracle. And I think it's, again, you know, over my career, you know, it used to be with Oracle, you would have a stack of books this high. You know, there wasn't Stack Overflow. Whilst the reference stuff was online, it wasn't easily accessible, and you know, you sort of had to learn, go residential course for 2 weeks to learn how to, you know, code a particular language or a particular, you know, database skill set. So, you know, now that's not the case. You know, there's online courses, Coursera, everything else. It's easy. You can go and I think, you know, daily I use, you know, we use Python. I mean, Python's a toolbox. As Sandra says, you can do everything from sort of huge, you know, data mining projects, sort of data normalization. You can run, you know, billions of data points through it, or you can do something as sort of trivial as, you know, download today's news and sort of push it in an inbox, you know, a nice pretty email for everyone to see as they sort of land in the office in the morning. But it's easy. You go online, there's all sorts of courses, all for free. You know, it doesn't have to cost anything. I think when we're hiring, or when I've hired into technical roles, you know, I've always looked for aptitude. I think, again, the packages you use now in finance, and it sort of varies a little bit depending on where you sit, you know, all easily available and freely available. It used to be the case that if you used certain things like Oracle, for example, you know, it used to cost tens of thousands of pounds for a license. You didn't get any experience until you got a job. Now you can go online and you can, you know, my daughters, they learn to code, you know, and you know, build get a GitHub repository, start, you know, look at open source projects, you know, find something that interests you, and sort of get involved and start digging around. It's the sort of the two things. You know, technology has an impact on every part of your role, and you don't necessarily have to be in a purely developer role to use Python. It's useful to automate. You know, our CFO uses it to automate his reconciliations once a month. You know, worked at a place, you know, we had teams of people spending 12 hours a day building out, you know, code sets and really involved models. But I think there's coding competitions, you know, there's all sorts of ways. You don't necessarily have to come from a STEM background. I think what the STEM background gives you that advantage, right? Like you say, you have the familiarity of the tools in going through your degree. You use MATLAB or R or Python. So, you know, you have a head start for sure. But I think compared to when I was at university, it's far easier to get access to exactly the same technology that is used day to day at, you know, funds, banks, everything else, you know, again, at the sort of the pointy end of the money, you know, the revenue generation. So, you know, you get involved and start digging around, I think. Yeah, and that doesn't have to rely on your degree subject. If, you know, you can do an English degree, but if you want, you know, if that stuff interests you, you know, you can do it as a side hustle, whatever the term is. You know, it doesn't have to be your degree subject.
And Joe, just to play devil's advocate here, what would you say are the merits of studying a more liberal arts degree?
So I happen to love the subject. So for me, it was about spending 3 years pursuing a passion. And I think if you can translate that, you know, then all to the good. Across the arts, right? It's questionable as to whether you're doing history, you know, you sort of get into, you know, you understand the ins and outs of, you know, the Black Death or the Great Fire of London, how that's applicable to your day to day. Your day to day is probably no different to, you know, Descartes or Plato, but the framework, you know, your approach to a problem, your ability to argue through, your ability to be analytical, you know, isn't predicated on the subject you teach. I mean, philosophy at university, that, you know, it was very very analytical, very logical, and it gave you a clearly defined approach that's applicable all the way through. As I said, but it's unarguable. You know, you're starting at a slight disadvantage, and I think if the technology piece is and that area is something that really interests you, yeah, then you need to show your sort of. It'd be very difficult to justify an application for a role that's broadly technical if you're standing there after sort of finishing your Bachelor of Arts, you know, with no, you know, without a GitHub repository or without some source code or without some some projects to show what you've done or why you're, you know, why you what it is you want to do what you do, right? It's all about, you know, there's so much more out there now. You can sort of go rootling around in your spare time. Yeah. You know, it's not reliant on you having a, you know, that proverbial chicken and egg. You don't need the experience in the commercial in a job to get a job.
It feels like the underlying theme is really study what you're passionate about and what you enjoy and what you like, because there's so many resources out there that if you ultimately end up being interested in a more technical role, you can learn to code on your own or in a group course, or perhaps your profession will even take you into some sort of more structured technical course to help you get up to speed. And just to be clear, I don't know how to code. I've never used Python or R or any of these programs, and I'm still working in the financial services industry. So the roles are so vast and wide. And of course, if you want to be a systematic trader, it probably makes sense to learn how to code, and probably would be helpful to have some kind of STEM background. But if you're working in a role that's more, you know, focused on sales or communication or even, you know, investment banking roles, which is where I come from, you don't necessarily need to have a super technical background. I studied economics and politics, and I think of my first year analyst class, I was one of the more technical first year analysts because I had studied economics and there were some math requirements associated with my field. I had friends who studied art history and were, you know, have gone very, very far in the financial services industry. So I think the punchline is study what you're passionate about, work really, really hard, be the best at what you're studying, and ultimately you'll find a role within this industry that makes sense. And you know, maybe it'll take some extra time to get up to speed with some of the technical elements, but it's totally doable. At least that's how I've interpreted the discussion on the panel. And I can see from some of the questions in the chat that there's a lot to juggle for students these days. There's a lot of requirements on academics and certain subjects and extracurricular activities and what organizations you're involved in, volunteer work. There's a lot to juggle, and it's hard to take stock of what to prioritize. But I think if you follow what you enjoy and what you're good at, you'll ultimately land in the right role.
So I concur to that, Katya, because I'm from an I've done an economics degree, so an economics background. Have no interest in technology whatsoever. I still can't code. However, my career has taken me through the point, and again, I think it's a testament that a lot of things now are technology driven and becoming more and more heavily dependent on technology. So throughout the course of my career, going into from when I started off as client facing, managing investment portfolios and going into compliance and risk management, I've had to come more and more in face with, you know, the real use cases for technology in terms of, you know, we talked about reconciliations. You know, as soon as I found out that having an automated process for reconciling anything kind of saves me tons and tons and tons of hours of going through manual reconciliation. That was almost like a ching-ching moment for me. I'm like, okay, what is this thing? How do we have to do it? Then you move on to MI reporting, because risk managing is all about providing the right insights. to the different governing bodies. And to provide that MI report, you've got a choice. You could either stay up all night, compute in numbers and tables, or you could create, you could have a process where you're creating a dashboard, and the dashboard pulls out the report for you. And I found myself speaking to my analytics team and my analytics colleagues. So tell me more about Tableau. How do you use Tableau? What does it do? And this is me, who has come from like a non-technology background and not having a real passion for technology, but through the course of having to deliver my role or performing my role more efficiently, I'm having to combine technology, and it's been great learning experience. I've really enjoyed it, and it's been exciting. To your point, I would say, do what you're passionate about, because that's where you shine. You can't be good at something that you're not happy with, but be very open. I would say be very open to embrace the use of technology, because it's really I think you just realize that how efficient and how quicker you can do things, and how you mitigate the risk of errors occurring by going through automated processes.
Just to kind of double click on the topic of efficiency and speeding things up and making things easier, generally that is what technology is associated with. But in some cases, you start to think, well, technology also means that we're available 24/7. It means that information is disseminated across the world at light speed. And then you start to think, well, actually, is this a good thing or a bad thing? And I'd love to hear your perspective on things like, big data, Sandra, data analysis and organizing large sets of data. Again, this is something that generally is associated with efficiency and in process improvement, time savings. I'd be interested to hear also kind of the other side of the spectrum on how potentially this has been a positive, but also potentially kind of complicated, because I imagine you're constantly competing to organize things the fastest and with the most kind of beautiful, efficient output. How do you think about this in kind of your day-to-day role?
So that's pretty much like, I'd say 75% of my role, in terms of, making processes a lot more efficient for the team, saving them a lot of time. I mean, if you think about the industry a few years ago, let's just say on average 5 years ago, I think everyone was a lot more into like doing everything on Excel, not having any of their data in the cloud, not having access to large time series. That's another thing that you can do a lot more with automated and big data in a way. Like in many cases, you've got like different, in our case, we're a fundamental shop. So, a lot of the analysts build their models on Excel, and they're, like it's hard to like think of how you can scale that without automation, without someone that's going to come in and build all of these processes for them. I think if I can just elaborate a little bit more on the value add, not just because it's what I do, but I think I see it on a day-to-day basis, like reports that would normally take people like, say half an hour a day to produce or to download, open, read, process, but only have like a single day snapshot rather than a full time series or the last week or any of these things. You can't do without technology in a way that like we build automation and these kind of processes nowadays. It helps that I'd say people are becoming a lot more open-minded about it. I think there was a bit of resistance, and maybe that's where my comment about blockchain in the beginning came from, because I've only been in the industry for 3 years, and I tell you there was a lot of resistance 3 years ago. So that's why I feel like for the really traditional shops and I'd say the smaller asset managers, it takes a lot of convincing to get people to embrace new technologies and use a lot of I guess, new ways of doing things. It worked so well in Excel. It worked so well the way things happened before. Why do we need to change? And also, it's a bit of like an overload of information. If you think about big data, suddenly, like asset managers and anyone in finance in general is bombarded with information on a daily basis, given how easily you can access it now. From automating news feeds or grabbing daily prices of thousands of companies and building reports on that. Like, it is a lot to take in terms of a change. So in that sense, I think it's great that technology is being used in the industry, but I think it's overwhelming for people who have been in it for much longer and are not used to it being this way. And it's just down to, I guess, showing people just how much time we're saving them and how much more information in a constructive way we can sort of give to the teams by analyzing the data correctly. I spend most of the time cleaning data as well, which is another thing that, like, around big data, people underestimate. Like, I don't get to the fancy AI model and all of these machine learning buzzwords that we hear. We don't get to them till like the last, I don't know, day of the projects. It takes like months to get to that point, because the amount of time you spend writing the code to get the data, and then the code to clean it and to analyze it and to actually extract information that's valuable and correct, because at the end of the day, they're investing based on this information, or like using this information to help with their investment decisions. You kind of need it to be correct and not allow for many mistakes. Otherwise, what ends up happening as well is people lose faith in the process and lose faith in the whole hype of tech and big data and all these models and machine learning. So there's a lot of responsibility, I think, that people underestimate in the whole automation. And because you can automate things, but you have to make sure that you're automating it correctly. You can process big data, but you also have to make sure you're processing it correctly. And I think that's one thing that people really underestimate when they get into the whole big data,
And if I may just hone into that point a little bit, I think when we look at the hesitations, Katya, to your point, the hesitations in terms of the perceived cons of using big data in that way or technology in that way, it's really to do with the regulatory concerns in that area, especially in financial services space, when you think of their sort of priorities to make sure the financial markets operate in the right way. However, if errors do occur in the data that's been provided, that is being used in making investment decisions, then that kind of really has a real harmful impact on the strategic and operational objective. So, that concern then is driven down or trickles down to the firms themselves. And, in a case where the questions then been asked, how much do you know about this automation of this system, this process that you're using? How do you maintain oversight? How much do you understand it? Because if you don't understand it, then you don't understand the exposures or the risk exposures. You don't understand the vulnerabilities that it probably imposes on your business, and therefore you can create the right risk management processes to make sure that, yes, it's an automated process, but there's also kind of a human sense check that goes along with it, that really understand, okay, the algos that go behind it are done in the right way, so we're getting the right output. And I think that's where the real hesitation comes through, right? In terms of, the harm that if it's not looked at in that way from a holistic point of view, then it could potentially lead to these overexposures. And that's where the regulators are sort of saying, well, hold on a moment, company A, if you're going to do this, then you have to demonstrate to us that you've got a hand over it. You understand what you're doing. You can sustain it. So from a financial and liquidity standpoint, it's affordable. It fits your business model. And, you could manage the risk that comes with it.
Yeah, I think, sorry.
Go ahead, Joe.
I mean, to Sandra's point, exactly that. I mean, I'd spent 4 years at a sort of fintech broker where we were rates based, and I think we had a team And I think of the team, 75–80% of the team spent all of their time cleaning and normalizing data. And it was probably the most valuable piece of intellectual property that the company owned after sort of 2-3 years was data sets going back 10–15 years, where all the data was normalized, every data point was labeled. Because, you know, to be slightly crude about it, it's sort of, you know, crap in, crap out, is that it only takes you know, 1 or 2 data points to skew things massively. And again, you know, if you've got a sort of traditional black box algorithm that's sort of taking some input and producing either, in a best case scenario, sort of a signal that suggests to someone on a trading desk buy or sell, or in a worst case scenario is actually facing the market itself. You know, there's been any number of particular instances where markets have moved, you know, to the detriment and in wildly and unexpected ways, because there's an algorithm or 2 algorithms start trading against each other, and people, you know, losing phenomenal amounts of money. And it's because, you know, the input isn't fully understood or isn't fully smoothed and normalized. So, you know, big data, such as it is, you know, is a solution to any number of problems, which is, for example, you know, how can we what's the best trade expression, you know, given historic events, but it's also a source of risk. Is you need to understand exactly what it is you're looking at, and yeah, that in and of itself is a huge challenge, and it's a fresh challenge. And I think the regulators, you know, talk to you know, your point is are very interested in this. It's all very well, you know, building these things, but you need to be able to prove that, you know, again, you know, previously we labeled every data point, where it came from, you know, whether it was normalized, whether it was smoothed, everything else, and we could track it all the way back. So you could, you know, you could demonstrate that to the clients, you could demonstrate that to the regulators. But it's a fresh problem. Like, that problem didn't exist 5 years ago. So, you know, it's a fresh industry, if you like, or a subset of the industry, or a fresh area, you know, that's having to be built alongside this wonderful way of essentially making money for clients, which is, you know, that's kind of what we do, right? Is generating alpha. Yeah.
Just to add quickly on that, I mean, obviously all of our goals is to generate alpha and to make money for our clients, for sure. But another thing that, like, just to go back to Katya's very initial question, is that the amount of time we save our team in terms of processes is genuinely, like, I don't think we can even put a number to it anymore. Just, you know, a lot of people are worried that, like, with all these automated processes, we replace roles and jobs with our codes. I don't think that's true. Just to touch on, like, the points that you've meant with, like, we need a human to check things and to, you know, like, make sure things are being done properly. But you know, besides the fact that, like, we've got a lot to do with the big data side of things and the cleaning and all, there's a different side to the technology where we are genuinely saving a lot of time with a lot of these processes that we're building and automating for the teams. And I think that's something that I guess we shouldn't forget. There's good and bad to everything. Like, there's good, and I don't want to say bad, because I think big data is great. I think it's more, there's good and complicated.
Yeah, I mean, we saved, you know, it's a very, our month-end reconciliations, you know, we moved that from 7 days down to half a day, you know, through automation. Nothing, it's not particularly complicated. It's certainly not rocket science, you know, and a relatively small data set. But it, you know, it used to be you would have to have, you know, teams of people doing it and then checking it and then reconciling and checking the checks and everything else. And you can, you know, we can do in Python in less than 30 seconds that, you know, you used to take someone 2 days to do in any series of sort of spreadsheets and VBA scripts and various other bits. So it's certainly a force for good.
It feels like there's kind of 2 elements here. You have the regulatory concerns around automation, and you also have an old school corporate mentality around humans wanting to be micromanaging everything and not wanting to outsource to machines. Do you think that there is a generational shift that's happening where mindsets are changing? We have fresh graduates that are very, very, very talented in things like programming languages, which may not have been the case in the past. We have regulators who now also have access to enormous amounts of data and previous case studies. Does it feel like things are changing?
Definitely. I would certainly say yes. I would say actually to the point where, as a firm, if you don't attract the millennials or the Zen, what they called, the new.
I think it's Gen Z. I think
For the audience, don't say that.
To attract the very the fresh intelligent graduates that are coming through, you have to be able to demonstrate that you've got this sort of like processes and equipment in place in terms of how they do the day-to-day jobs, because if not, they just don't look at you, because they're not used to Excel spreadsheets, they're not used to doing things manually. Throughout the degree, things have been done very differently, so they need to step into that environment. So yes, there's certainly a mindset shift. And I think secondly, it's also been almost forced. So even take away the generational shift, the pandemic situation has forced the dinosaurs, maybe I'm one of them as well, probably, but has forced the dinosaurs to actually come on board and actually begin to think about things and want to do things differently, and also open up, introduce new ideas to firms on how to do things. So I certainly think that, in that space, there is a mindset shift. There's still going to be some hesitation because firms are caught in this really between a rock and a hard place sometimes, in terms of, yes, the time saving is phenomenal in terms of what these processes can do, but on the other side, especially for more stringent regulated firms, it's almost like, well, if we ever found to be in a breach, then the impact of that from a regulatory standpoint completely wipes away whatever benefits there were in the first place of doing that. So it's almost juggling and say, okay, where do you strike the balance, and what do we have to do to make sure we can actually have these processes in place, because it helps us in our operational effectiveness and how we do things. It helps us make money for our client, it helps the business, but we also at the same time don't want to cost ourselves like almost out of the markets, if you may say. So it's having that balance and knowing what needs to be in place to make sure you can have both, because it's having the best of both worlds, right?
Absolutely. I guess you have, we had I listened to an interesting discussion the other day around how we currently have a situation where there's so many different generations in the workplace, because we're starting to work earlier in life and we're working later and later and later in life. And so you have many different generations working under one roof and in one workplace. And how do you manage the technical component of that with the impact of technology, but also some of the kind of softer elements around attitudes and character and mindset and what's important. You have the Google mindset of the free lunches and the ping pong table, and not everyone agrees with that. And certainly the financial services industry has come a long way. Just to kind of round things out as we're hitting up against the hour, what would be the kind of one or two pieces of advice, life, tech, finance, that you would give students looking at roles within the financial services industry? Maybe we start with Joe.
I don't know. I mean, I think there's so much information out there, and I think the challenge is how to filter it. But I think if you're, this program, the Gain Empowered program is a case in point. There's far more accessed information out there. There's you should be able to sit in an interview or in an application and explain very clearly why you want to do and why you want to work where you work. You know, there's things like Glassdoor. You can do your research on who you're working for, the area, the technologies that sit behind it, and everything else. And a lot of that information's, it's all readily available. It's all free. So, you know, you can do your research. It's you know, not so much the case as it used to be when I started, where you sort of rock up at an investment bank's graduate trainee program. You don't know whether you're going to go into HR or IB or prop trading, and you sort of, you know, you get sent where where they decide to send you, whatever the intake is. So, you know, it seems now there's far more pressure in terms of, as you talked about earlier, you know, getting onto internships and everything else. But I think, you know, you can do your research. You know, Bloomberg have any number of free resources, Coursera, you know, technology. You can do Python courses. You can do all this stuff and try to get ahead of what this, you know, what these things might be looking like.
Sisieta?
Yeah, I'm just going to sort of piggyback on the back of what Joe has said. Certainly getting ahead as you're studying, so being very clear as to, you know, what you want to do or what areas you want to go into finance, but also as you're studying your degree, look for avenues to explore more in different areas within finance and get, you know, get placements or sort of 1 week placements, for example. So a lot of firms offer non-paid placements now just to get the exposure. So if it's a case of say, oh, you know, I want to understand what it would look like to combine tech and finance, for example, look for a firm. I mean, you know, the different firms that offer different opportunities, especially during the summer. You have a lot of sort of spring sort of opportunities where graduates and interns. So what I did with myself in my career is that I always, in the summer, I always looked for a job that was linked to what I felt I wanted to do in financial services, whether that was paid or unpaid, but I felt that that gave me an edge when I came out of university. On my CV, I was able to go into firms and actually demonstrate that, you know, I do have an understanding beyond what I've been taught in the classroom. I think that's very, very key. And also be very open-minded in financial services now to that, you know, there is a lot more of technology coming through. So, you know, be sure to look at, you know, potentially combining both, because that would also give you an advantage, you know, if you've got some technological experience to go with finance degree.
Sandra?
I was literally just going to say be open-minded. I think I'm just speaking from personal experience. I've actually personally always avoided the financial industry. Probably shouldn't be saying this out loud, but I did. But mostly because, you know, back in the day when I finished my degrees and when I was studying and I was a lot more passionate about, you know, the physics and math side of things, I didn't think there was any use case for, you know, my skill and my interest in the industry. Maybe it was a combination of like one not so exciting experience in the industry, and therefore I ruled out the entire financial industry, which was probably a bad idea, and me not being open-minded. But I would just say, yeah, be open-minded and definitely try to maybe explore the different roles you can find in the industry with what you're interested in terms of like what skill you'd like to apply on a daily basis. I think that's super important, because at the end of the day, what we do as a job is what we spend most of our time doing. And I think people underestimate that. And if you're not finding that interesting, or you don't get excited about, like, I do actually find coding pretty exciting, and that's why I enjoy my job. But I think if you don't enjoy what you're doing and you're doing that 10 hours a day, then you will actually struggle, but you wouldn't know unless you actually tried. And leverage networks, like something like Gain is great. But also, like when I started, I'm not gonna say when I started, LinkedIn wasn't really a thing. You know, you didn't have meetups, you didn't have all of these like great events that people ran in big cities like London. And I think that's one thing that, you know, nowadays a lot of graduates really have an advantage where, you know, there are ways to meet people. I get messages on LinkedIn for like coffee chats regularly, and I happily do them, because I think it's super important to just speak to people and try to get into like different sides of the industry to eventually know where you want to focus your time. think that's probably where I'd.
Really insightful from our panelists. Thank you so much. I guess from me, I'll just add two things in terms of advice, which is simply work hard and do so with a smile on your face, because having a positive attitude gets you very, very, very far in life, because people like to work with people that they like. And I think that sometimes goes under the radar in some of these discussions. Just very simple, have a positive attitude and have a smile on your face, and you will be surprised how effective that very simple tactic will be. So panelists, thank you so much. Really, really enjoyable having this discussion this evening. I hope that our students found it very interesting, and we look forward to participating in future GAIN events. And with that, I wish everyone a wonderful evening.
Thanks, Katya. Thanks, everyone.
Cheers, folks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.